cosmic canyons.
Memories of Innsmouth by Josef Rossmann. Set in the wonderfully terrifying world of H.P. Lovecraft. Lukas gazed out the train window at the passing landscape and took a deep breath. The last few weeks had drawn him into a whirlwind of new impressions, fleeting acquaintances, and constant amazement at the seemingly endless expanses of America. In his mid-30s and originally from a quiet town near Vienna, he had saved all his vacation days and overtime for this big dream of his, 3 months in the USA. He wanted to cross borders, lose himself in a foreign world, and find himself in the process. The fact that he was now heading to northern New England in the late fall, when it was cool, had actually been a spontaneous idea. Boston had seduced him with its historic charm and vibrant nightlife, but something drew him further, an inner longing for the inexplicable. In a small cafe, he came across rumors about a town called Innsmouth. He had also heard about Arkham time and again, albeit only in vague hints. If you're looking for real secrets, you have to visit Arkham, and if you're really brave, go on to Innsmouth, an older man in Boston whispered to him, acting as if it were the most scandalous tip in the world. Lukas had originally planned to change course at the latest after Arkham and visit Salem, as he had been interested in the famous witch trials since childhood. However, with every mile, the train took him closer to Arkham. A dark foreboding crept into his heart, and he began to find it strangely appealing. The days grew shorter, and the light through the windows grew paler. It was as if he were approaching a shadow world lurking behind the normal, modern USA. When Lukas left the Arkham train station, a cold gust of wind hit the back of his neck immediately. At first glance, the place seemed sleepy, even though it was home to the renowned Miskatonic University. The houses with their pointed gables and dark shingle roofs looked like they were from the 19th century. They stretched like skeletons into the overcast sky. There was little traffic and hardly anyone on the streets, even though it was only the middle of the day. Lukas made his way cautiously toward the city center. He had booked a small bed and breakfast in a narrow side street. The old brick building creaked with every gust of wind, exuding a slightly musty coziness. The landlady, an elderly woman named Mrs. Wheeler, did not seem particularly interested in Lukas's origins or the purpose of his trip. She greeted him politely, however, and asked if he was there to visit the university library, as so many other strangers were. Lukas smiled and said no, but hinted that he was interested in the area's historical peculiarities. In the evening, he treated himself to a walk along the river. The famous Arkham Library was surrounded by massive, almost bare oak trees that looked like thin-fingered ghosts in the pale light. He found the architecture impressive, but he felt disturbed by something in the air. There was an unfamiliar smell of mold and dampness from Boston. Perhaps it came from the river, or the marshland, beyond the bridge. On his way back, something unexpected happened. He heard light footsteps behind him, so he turned around. A young woman with chestnut-brown hair and an open, curious gaze stood there, as if she had taken the same route. She didn't look like a local, and she also seemed to notice something unusual about Arkham. She wore a light coat that was too thin for the autumn chill, yet she didn't seem cold. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to scare you," she said. "I'm Sarah. I guess we're going the same way." Lukas noticed her slight American accent. He had often heard it in Boston, but here it sounded friendlier. He introduced himself, and they walked side by side for a while as the pale evening light cast Arkham in dark shadows. Sarah said she had just returned from a research trip. She was interested in old myths and legends, and Arkham's university library was famous for its obscure works. "They say they have manuscripts here that can't be found anywhere else," she explained. "Some kind of Necronomicon, but that's probably just a rumor." Lukas wasn't sure how serious she was. He laughed, but he still felt uneasy. Images of long-buried secrets, ghostly rituals and sinister forces lurking beneath dusty tomes came to life in his imagination. The next morning, Lukas happened to meet Sarah at breakfast at the bed and breakfast. It turned out that she was also staying there. They talked for a while, and Lukas learned that Sarah was conducting research in New England. She had found fragmentary clues about eerie events in a place called Innsmouth. My father was in the Navy archives in Boston and discovered some strange documents about a raid in the 1920s. There was mention of Innsmouth. Apparently a number of people were arrested and houses were blown up. And, if you believe the reports, something else, much more terrible, was discovered. But no one likes to talk about it. It's as if it all disappeared. Sarah leaned forward and lowered her voice. Something about it draws me in. I know it sounds crazy, but there must be a reason why there are so many gaps in the official records. Something happened in Innsmouth that goes beyond normal crime. Lukas cleared his throat awkwardly. He felt the same inexplicable fascination with stories of fish-like creatures living in dilapidated houses and making sacrifices to strange gods. Was it all just sailors' yarns, or was there really something behind it beyond human imagination? The two decided to spend the day together in Arkham and possibly move on the next day. As they stood in Arkham's small market square, they noticed the locals' hostile glances. An older man who was picking his nose glared at them when Sarah asked if there was a direct connection to Innsmouth. He muttered something incomprehensible and turned away as if talking about it were taboo. In the evening, at a small pub, they drank bitter local ale. Sarah leafed through her notes and showed Lukas newspaper articles from the 1920s. The articles mentioned a government cleanup operation in Innsmouth, officially for smuggling. However, the numerous arrests and house demolitions sounded excessive and corroborated the rumors they had heard. Whatever was there, it hasn't gone away, she said seriously. I want to go there. You? Lukas hesitated. Yes. Somehow I feel the need to see it. His voice sounded determined. Despite an inner voice warning him, he felt magically drawn to this mystery. The next morning dawned grey and foggy. It was the day they had decided to go to Innsmouth. According to the timetable, there were 2 buses a day from Arkham, a connection that hardly anyone used. The arrival of the bus was an ominous moment. The old grey vehicle rattled to a halt in front of the deserted Arkham bus station. The driver, a gaunt man with watery eyes, stared at Lukas and Sarah as if they were unwelcome intruders. They got on, and no one else was inside. The engine roared, and the bus jerked into motion. During the journey, the landscape became increasingly shrouded in thick mist, rising from the marshy lowlands. Every now and then, they passed abandoned barns and rotten trees, their bare branches forming eerie silhouettes. Lukas wished he had a blanket. He felt cold inside. Sarah tried to strike up a conversation with the driver, but he only grunted in response. Do you think the weather will clear up later? She asked, but she didn't receive an answer. Only a hiss came from his throat as he kept his gaze fixed ahead. After what felt like an eternity, a pale, weathered sign announced, Innsmouth. The road led to a main street lined with houses that had seen better days. Dilapidated facades and cracked windows were visible, and the air smelled of salt and fish. The bus stopped in front of a rundown building with a torn awning. Faded letters spelled out, Innsmouth Bus Depot. Last stop, the driver croaked suddenly, motioning for them to get off. Laden with their hand luggage, they obeyed and stepped out into the cold, damp air, which made it difficult to breathe instantly. No sooner had the door closed behind them than the bus rattled off and disappeared into the fog. Lukas and Sarah looked around. The streets seemed deserted. A row of 2-story houses, some brick and some weathered wood, lined the main street. Many windows were boarded up, and most of the shops appeared to be closed. Lukas caught fleeting movements out of the corner of his eye behind some of the tattered curtains, but as soon as he looked over, all signs of life disappeared. The pungent smell of fish was salty and foul, as if decades of garbage had been dumped into the harbor. A dull silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant sound of the sea. "Where are we going to stay?" Sarah asked quietly. They had heard rumors of a hotel called Gilman House, but no one recommended it. Nevertheless, they set out to find it. They didn't have to walk far because after a few blocks, they reached the building, a large Victorian-style house whose facade might once have been magnificent. Now, however, everything was shabby and grey, and the sign above the door was barely legible. Inside, it wasn't much better. The lobby smelled musty, and old wood creaked with every step. A man with a pale face and blurred features emerged from behind the counter. His eyes were widely spaced, and the whites were clouded yellow. In a pitiful voice, he asked, "Room?" Sarah nodded and tried to smile. "2 rooms, please, maybe just for one night." The man stared at them both, grinned half-heartedly and pulled out 2 rusty keys. "Second floor, rooms 204 and 206. Check-in proceeded without further words. As they climbed the stairs, Lukas felt the man's gaze on his back, as if he were following their every move. The rooms were dark, and the wallpaper was peeling in many places. Lukas could barely feel the daylight penetrating through the dirty windows. His watch showed 3 o'clock, but the sky looked like dusk already. Exhausted, he sat down briefly on the bed. The mattress felt damp. After a short rest, Sarah knocked. They decided to at least look around a little. They wanted to go down to the harbor, where they hoped to learn more about this strange place. The alleys grew narrower, and the road sloped gently downward. On the way, they passed an old-fashioned church, or at least, the building looked like a church. However, it didn't have a real cross. Only a broken wooden cross hung crookedly, and a faded inscription above the portal was barely legible. Lukas thought he recognized a coat of arms or symbol that vaguely resembled a stylized fish. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. A man with an unkempt beard and pale skin walked past them. His eyes bulged, similar to the hotel porter's, and he muttered, "Strangers, should they return?" Then he disappeared into a side alley. Sarah swallowed. Did you see his hands? His fingers were strangely curved, as if there were webbing between them. Lukas tried to hide his own uneasiness. Maybe a skin disease, or a mutation. They continued on to the desolate harbor. There were a few dilapidated sheds and a rotten-looking jetty with 2 boats tied to it that didn't look seaworthy. The harbor water was murky and almost oily. The fishy smell was now even more intense and made Lukas almost gag. Before they left the jetty, a shadowy figure appeared. It was a woman in her mid-50s, wearing a greasy coat. Her hair was wet and uncombed. Her face was striking with protruding eyes that fixed on Sarah. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed. "This is no place for strangers. You'd better leave before the sea takes you." Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but the woman shuffled away, making a strange grinding sound, as if she couldn't lift her feet properly. In the distance, seagulls cawed harshly and mournfully. Back in the town center, Lukas and Sarah noticed more and more people appearing, but they seemed to be actively avoiding them. Nevertheless, some glances were unavoidable, and they always had the same expression: dismissive, curious, and almost hungry. As dusk fell, the cool air became almost unbearable. From his hotel room window, Lukas saw individual lights flickering in houses. Elsewhere, it remained dark. An unconscious shiver ran through him. He remembered the story of the raid that had happened about 100 years ago. What exactly had the government found here? How could the place still be inhabited, despite its decay after all this time? Sarah joined him in the room, her laptop under her arm. She had received a weak Wi-Fi signal and could retrieve only sparse data. She tried to find out more about Innsmouth, but found almost nothing but old legends and horror stories on forums. It says here that the people had contact with strange sea creatures and worshipped idols that live under the sea. Apparently, there were even hybrid creatures. Lukas frowned. Sounds like something out of a horror story. But when I look at these inhabitants, they fell silent. Suddenly, they heard a loud creaking in the hallway, followed by shuffling footsteps. Then, they heard a noise like something wet being dragged across the floor. Lukas reflexively turned off the light. They both listened with bated breath. This was followed by guttural sounds that were inhuman. They remained frozen for several minutes until the footsteps continued and faded into the distance. The next morning, the weather was hardly any better, but the town's mood seemed to have changed. As Lukas and Sarah left the hotel, they noticed several women in old-fashioned clothing whispering to each other as they walked along the harbour. A gaunt man, leaning against a house wall, nodded to them wordlessly. They decided to take a closer look at the church that they had only briefly inspected the day before. When they arrived, they found that the large wooden doors were open. An eerie, almost solemn silence hung in the room. A few residents sat in the pews with their eyes downcast. At the front stood an altar with no clear Christian symbols. Instead of a cross, there was a small emblem that resembled a fish with strange carvings in its open mouth. Shortly thereafter, a figure appeared in a dark, shapeless robe reminiscent of a monk's habit. Its face was hidden under a deep hood. This person spoke in a slow, preacher-like voice, but the words were incomprehensible, as if spoken in a foreign language. Lukas thought he recognized gurgling sounds and, occasionally, a murmur. Then, he heard prayer formulas again. Sarah shivered, and Lukas felt her hand tremble on his arm. But before they could flee, the hood turned toward them. The face behind the hood was shadowy. Only two strangely glowing eyes were visible. "You are a stranger. You are curious. Perhaps you want to know more. Come tonight when the moon rises." The voice was a mixture of deep whispers and throaty croaks. A murmur ran through the people in the pews. Someone hissed. Others nodded. Lukas felt his heart race. Sarah could only manage a strained, "Why?" The priest, if that was what he was, simply spread his arms. "We always welcome those who are worthy to partake in the sacrament." Sarah glanced at Lukas briefly with a worried look as the figure disappeared back into the semi-darkness. There was no clear invitation, yet it was a clear hint that something would happen that night. They spent the rest of the day in suspense. They were undecided as to whether they should actually go. On the one hand, there was an undeniable fascination and thirst for knowledge, perhaps stronger in Sarah than Lukas. On the other hand, the whole town was filled with a deceptive, lurking atmosphere. As evening approached, Lukas stepped outside for some fresh air. An almost full moon rose in the sky, shining through a crack in the clouds and bathing the dilapidated houses in an eerie, silvery glow. In the distance, he heard the monotonous sound of waves, occasionally interrupted by a loud, strange horn, as if a boat were approaching. Suddenly, he saw a group of barely recognizable figures shuffling toward the church. Lukas ducked behind a half-collapsed wall and waited until they had passed. Their breathing sounded heavy and almost gurgling, and their bodies were hunched over in a strange way. One of them carried a lantern that revealed a translucent object around the outline of a head. Lukas thought he saw gill slits or scales, but it could have been an illusion. He returned to the hotel and found Sarah in her room. She had turned off all the lights and was sitting in the darkness. When he looked at her questioningly, she whispered, "They were walking down the hallways here. At least 4 or 5 of them. They were asking about us." Lukas felt adrenaline rush through his veins. "Maybe we should leave." "As soon as possible," Sarah shook her head. "Where to?" "You saw that there are hardly any buses here. The next one isn't until tomorrow morning. Besides, I know. I can't just leave before." She faltered. He understood. A strange force held her in this place. Lukas might have doubted it, but deep down, he felt an eerie curiosity too. The thought of discovering the unimaginable was both terrifying and tempting. Shortly before midnight, the whole town was plunged into darkness. Only a faint light burned at the church. Lukas and Sarah cautiously ventured outside. An icy wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it a heavy, brackish smell. The church door stood open. Inside, candles scattered in irregular patterns on the floor were the only source of light. About a dozen people in dark cloaks crowded around the altar while the priest stood before it, reciting strange verses in a raspy voice. The language sounded like a mixture of ancient dialects, seafaring slang, and a gurgling hum. Then there was a commotion. The congregation divided into 2 groups. Lukas and Sarah stood spellbound in the far corner, unsure if they had been noticed. "Step forward!" the priest suddenly shouted, looking directly at them. Without meaning to, they moved a little closer. One of the hooded figures led them to the altar. Lukas smelled the musty cloth and damp cold emanating from the figures. Behind the altar, a hidden hatch in the floor opened, and a cold gust of wind blew up from it immediately. The stench of fish was almost suffocating. A ladder disappeared into the darkness below, and a faint gurgling sound seemed to come from it, as if there was water down there. At that moment, 2 of the hooded men grabbed Sarah by the arms. Lukas jumped up. "Hey, let her go!" The priest laughed in a creaky voice. "She is worthy. The sea gods demand her sacrifice." A murmur went through the crowd, and Lukas saw madness in their eyes. His hand trembled. He wanted to do something, but he was grabbed with brute force and pushed to the ground. A masked figure held him down. Sarah screamed. "Lukas!" She fought back, but she was alone against these alienated people. 2 of them pulled up their robes, exposing their amphibian-like skin, and began a loud gurgling chant. "We bring the sacrifice so that the sea may. Be merciful to us." A greenish, unnatural light flickered from the hatch, as if coming from below. Something slimy and slurping stirred in the depths. Lukas sensed an inhuman presence so alien that he almost lost consciousness. In a fit of panic, Lukas mustered all his strength, tore himself free, and lashed out. To his surprise, one of the hooded men gave way, as if he had underestimated Lukas. Lukas immediately scrambled to his feet and pushed the next figure away. In the confusion, Sarah managed to kick another attacker, freeing herself halfway. But at that moment, the priest grabbed her. His hood slipped down, and Lukas caught a glimpse of a disfigured, fish-like face that still bore grotesque human features. There seemed to be no way out. A wild commotion broke out. People screamed. Someone beat a drum, and Lukas saw Sarah being dragged toward the hatch. She clung to the edge of the altar and let out piercing screams. A second powerful thrust sent Lukas falling onto the priest's back. He let go of Sarah for a split second. Then, 2 other hooded figures grabbed her. She slipped and fell into the hole. She disappeared into the darkness with a horrified scream. The world seemed to stand still. Lukas wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His gaze fell on the hatch, where the green glow pulsed and swirled. He thought he saw something shiny and black below. A strange creature lunging at Sarah. Her gasping, blood-curdling scream echoed back, mixed with a smacking sound, before being drowned out by gurgling and rumbling. In a fit of frantic desperation, Lukas threw a wooden candlestick into the crowd and ran toward the exit like a madman. Several hands tried to grab him, but he lashed out, kicking and biting, not knowing where he found the strength. At the last moment, he jumped out of the church into the foggy night. Only when he stood panting in a dark alley did he realize what had happened. His stomach cramped, and he almost collapsed. Sarah had been dragged into this damp, horrible abyss and sacrificed to a monstrosity beyond all human imagination. But his pursuers did not give up. Lukas heard hoarse cries and saw lights and lanterns moving through the fog. Without thinking, he rushed toward the harbor, the only direction he could go without detouring. At the harbor, water splashed against the rotten pier. He could vaguely make out some boats. Individual torches burned here too, and figures moved about, as if preparing for something. Lukas ducked behind a broken plank. Behind him, he heard grunting, a wild mixture of foreign languages and angry screeches. The creatures, humans or half-beings he didn't know, combed the area. Their lanterns danced like crazy will-o'-the-wisps. Lukas noticed a small old rowboat moored to a stake with a worn rope. Perhaps it was his only chance. He jumped over and untied the rope with trembling hands. No sooner had he thrown himself in than he began pushing off from the jetty with long strokes. Suddenly, a huge figure appeared in his field of vision on the quay. The moon shone on something scaly and slimy that was half out of the water. A head with enormous fish eyes appeared, its gill slits twitching. The creature let out a silent scream and opened its mouth to reveal several rows of pointed teeth. Lukas rowed frantically, kicking the bottom of the boat to escape faster. Something slid into the water and followed him. He could feel it in the irregular splashing of the waves. His pursuers on land called out to each other. Some seemed to be following the shore, while the scaly creature harassed him in the water. With one last burst of strength, Lukas rowed deeper into the fog, away from the lights and this city. He rowed until he thought his arms would fall off. The monster surfaced briefly, but then it seemed as if it could no longer locate him. The moonlight was obscured by thick clouds, which helped him remain hidden. Only when he had almost no strength left did the silhouette of a large fishing boat appear on the horizon. Lukas screamed as loudly as he could. At first, he feared it might be the creatures again, but then a spotlight was aimed at him, and men's voices called out in confusion. Lukas was pulled aboard. He was half hypothermic, his lips blue, and his voice little more than a croak. Desperately, he stammered about Innsmouth, monsters, and the sacrifice of a girl. The fishermen looked at him as if he were crazy. Nevertheless, they believed him when he said that something terrible must have happened. They wrapped him in blankets and gave him hot tea. They slowly moved away from the coast. Before falling into a semi-sleep, Lukas saw the pale moon above the foggy sea and the distant glow of a city that had fallen prey to its own ancient corruption. A few hours later, the fishing boat docked in a neighboring village. The fisherman called an ambulance, and Lukas was taken to a clinic. He was at the end of his strength, but the images burned indelibly in his mind. Sarah's terrified gaze, her scream, the creature lurking in the depths, and the stares of the fish people. When he was discharged days later, no one believed him. Even the police listened to his account, but they reacted hesitantly. They thought he was either mentally disturbed or a foreign nutcase with too much imagination. The question of Sarah led to no concrete search, and no traces were found. There were hardly any official records for Innsmouth, and its residents were barely registered in the system. Lukas booked a flight back to Europe. In the few days he had left in New England, however, he was plagued by nightmares. Night after night, he saw the cold church, the damp catacombs under the altar, the bizarre chants, and the swirling green light down there. Sometimes, he saw Sarah's figure, enveloped in algae and tentacles, calling to him. Years later, when Lukas told his story, people advised him to seek professional help. But he knew he wasn't crazy. He knew what he had experienced: a town belonging to the sea, a cult existing beyond all human morality, and a sacrifice to deep-sea idols no one dared speak of. Sometimes, he thought about returning to the United States to seek justice, or at least clarity. But he was afraid of what he might find. He sensed that Innsmouth still existed, hidden behind fog and silence. It was still lurking and waiting for travelers and curious people drawn by the call of horror. Then, at night, he relived that final scene, Sarah's fading screams. He would never forget how she disappeared into the darkness, descending into something not of this world. Stories are sometimes more than stories, he often muttered to himself. I've experienced it. No one will ever help me understand how deep this horror goes. Lukas continued to live with this knowledge, always accompanied by the inescapable awareness that there are places where the laws of nature are merely a thin veil. Places where the unspeakable lurks and the calling depths are consecrated. Places like Innsmouth, where horror never ends. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. Your support helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, stay curious. See you in the cosmic canyons.